When Lords of the Fallen rebooted in 2023, it had a really strong atmosphere. Visually, it nailed the oppressive dark fantasy tone. The world felt heavy, grim, almost suffocating, but in a good way. And mechanically, there were some genuinely cool ideas, especially the whole umbral system. But let's be honest, the combat was the sticking point for a lot of people. It wasn't that it was broken or unplayable, it just didn't feel quite right. Attacks sometimes felt like they were gliding through the air instead of cutting through weight. Movement had this slight looseness to it. You'd dodge and it almost felt like you were skating rather than planting your feet and committing. And in a Souls-like, that tiny difference matters more than anything. Because these games live or die by feel, not graphics, not even build variety. It's the physical sensation of pressing a button and believing the character is actually there in that space. Over time, especially with the 2.0 patches, they did improve it. The game today feels noticeably tighter than it did at launch, but first impressions tend to stick. And that floaty label followed it. So when I watched this new combat teaser and then listened to the 40-minute or so dev breakdown, what stood out to me immediately was this. They're not pretending that the criticism didn't happen, they're addressing it head on. And that already makes this sequel more interesting to me. One thing that really caught my attention in the podcast is that the developers themselves used the word floaty. That's not us projecting, that's them acknowledging it, and that's huge, because when a studio recognizes something that players felt, usually means they've been working on it for a while. They talk a lot about grounding the player more this time, making characters feel heavier, more planted, reducing the subtle slide after attacks, making sure animations lock you in properly, instead of feeling like they drift. Now, that may sound small, but here's the thing, in this genre, 10% improvement in responsiveness can feel like 50%. If your dodge has clearer start and end frames, you feel safer committing. If your attack recovers more predictably, you feel more in control. If your character's feet actually feel anchored to the ground, your brain believes in the weight of the weapon. That's immersion through mechanics, and what I like is that they're not marketing this as faster necessarily, they're marketing it as tighter. There's a difference. Faster combat doesn't automatically mean better combat. If anything, faster can make floatiness worse. What you want is deliberate speed that feels controlled. And based on how they describe their animation reworks and input refinements, it sounds like that's what they're aiming for. Not chaos, but precision. The next big shift they talked about is aggression, and this is where things get interesting. Clearly pushing the combat toward a more forward driving style. Less roll away, reset, circle the enemy for 10 seconds, more staying engaged, more pressure. Not exactly Sekiro, but something akin to it. You can see it in the teaser. The player closes distance quickly. Jump attacks flow more naturally into combos. There's less downtime between exchanges. And in the podcast, they mentioned that they want players in the pocket of enemies more often. That phrase stuck with me, because being in the pocket means you're close. You're trading blows and reading movements in real time. It's riskier. But here's the key part. They also said enemies are faster and more reactive too. So, this isn't a power fantasy where you just overwhelm everything. Although, I'm sure you can reach that level at some point. If you commit aggressively, enemies will respond aggressively. That creates those moments where you barely dodge something and immediately counter. The danger, of course, is balance. If aggression becomes spammy, the combat loses weight. But if they tune stamina, recovery frames, and enemy tracking, this could make fights feel more intense without feeling messy. And honestly, Lords of the Fallen has always leaned a little more toward that kind of combat instead of pure methodical patience. So leaning into aggression might actually suit it better. Now, one of the things that surprised me in the podcast was how much time they spent talking about dual wielding. In the first game, dual wielding existed, but it didn't always feel distinct. A lot of the time, it felt like you were just getting extra swings, rather than a completely different combat rhythm. This time, they're making it clear that dual wielding is meant to feel like its own thing. From what they described, they've reworked how combo chains flow when you're holding two weapons, so it's not just alternating left and right attacks, there are actual design chains that lean into momentum. Dual wielding should feel aggressive, it should feel relentless. It shouldn't feel like you're just splitting damage across two hands. They also mentioned improvements to animation blending, which is fancy talk for smoother transitions between hits. Less awkward snapping, less of that slight disconnect between input and motion. If they've nailed that, dual wield builds could finally feel like a true high risk, high reward playstyle. You commit more, you stay closer, you burn stamina faster, but in return you overwhelm enemies with pressure. And in a combat system that's leaning more into aggression overall, dual wielding might end up being one of the most satisfying ways to play. Not just viable, satisfying. Now, on the opposite end of that spectrum, they also talked about heavy weapons, and this is where the grounded philosophy really matters, because if there's one area where floatiness absolutely cannot exist, it's with the heavy weapons. When you swing something massive, it has to feel massive, if you know what I'm saying. They specifically mentioned improving impact feedback, better hit reactions, stronger animation follow-through, more convincing enemy stagger responses, and that's huge, because heavy weapons are all about commitment. You wind up, you lock yourself into that animation, and if you miss, you pay for it. But if you connect, it should feel devastating. In the teaser, you can actually see a bit more snap on impact. Enemies react harder. There's less of that soft, spongy feeling. They also talked about adjusting recovery windows so that heavy builds don't feel artificially punished. Not faster, but fairer. And I think that's the right approach. Heavy combat shouldn't feel slow because it's clunky. It should feel slow because you're choosing power over speed. If they've successfully separated these two things, clunky versus deliberate, that alone could completely change how people perceive the sequel's combat. The perception of weight is everything. The last big thing they covered was executions. Now, visually, executions already looked pretty good in the first game. They were brutal and fit the tone, but what they're focusing on this time isn't just how they look, it's how they flow. In the podcast, they talked about making executions feel less like a hard cut and more like a continuation of combat. Less pause animation plays and more seamless transition from stagger to finisher. Something that's really important for pacing. Nothing kills intensity faster than the game suddenly feeling like it's stopping for a smash X button for execution every 30 seconds. From what they've described, they've refined how enemies enter that vulnerable state. It's clearer when you've earned it, and the animation timing feels snappier. Again, execution should feel like a reward, a release of tension, a punctuation mark at the end of a risky exchange, and if combat overall is becoming more aggressive, then executions become even more important. Kinda like how an inboxer takes a breath after staying in the pocket too long. But here's what I'm curious about. How often will they trigger? If they're too frequent, they lose impact. If they're too rare, they feel disconnected from the core loop. That balance is going to matter. But if they get it right, executions could feel less like scripted moments and more like a natural climax to a fight. And that's a huge difference. On the other side of things, some more subtle but important changes they talked about in the podcast was enemy behavior. And this might actually be more important than any player-side change, because you can make the player feel heavier, more grounded, more aggressive, but if enemies still behave the same way, the combat won't actually feel any different. They mentioned improving enemy reaction logic, so instead of enemies just tanking hits until a hidden stagger meter fills up, there's more immediate feedback. Small reactions to smaller hits. More dynamic responses depending on what you're using. And that can transform how combat feels. When enemies react properly, it creates a conversation. You hit them, they flinch. They recover, they counter. You dodge, you punish. That back and forth is what makes these games so satisfying. They also hinted at enemies being more proactive, closing distances in a smarter way, applying pressure instead of just waiting for their turn. That pairs really well with their push toward aggression. If both sides are more active, fights become less about circling and more about reading. And reading is what separates good combat from average combat. So for me, the AI changes might end up being the quiet improvement that actually makes the biggest difference. Now, they didn't spend the entire podcast on multiplayer, but what they did say was interesting. They're clearly aware that PvP balance was way off in the first game. Some builds were oppressive, some felt completely useless. And when combat itself feels slightly off, that imbalance becomes even more obvious. If the core combat is tighter this time, more predictable recovery, cleaner hit detection, clearer reactions, PvP automatically improves. They also mentioned refining invasions and co-op systems to make them feel less disruptive and more intentional. That's important because multiplayer in Souls-likes can either enhance tension or completely derail pacing, especially if you're a noob. What I'm hoping is that the aggression shift doesn't turn PvP into pure chaos. You know, aggressive systems are fun in PvE because enemies are designed around it. In PvP, aggression has to be readable. There has to be space for mind games. If they've tuned stamina, recovery, and hit confirmation carefully, PvP could actually benefit massively from these combat refinements, and if multiplayer feels more stable, more skill-based this time, that gives the sequel a lot more longevity. Because let's be honest, replayability matters. Let's just hope they fix the wonky netcode this time. So, after watching the teaser multiple times and listening to the full 40-minute breakdown, here's where I stand. This doesn't feel like a cosmetic sequel, it feels more like a kind of correction. They aren't adding flashy systems just to market something new, they're going back to the foundation. Weight, responsiveness, enemy behavior. The stuff that actually determines whether combat feels good or not. And that's encouraging because the world, the atmosphere, the art direction, that was never really the issue. Lords of the Fallen has always had a unique style. It has tone. Combat just needed refinement. The real question is execution. No pun intended. Everything they've described so far sounds right. Heavier movements, tighter inputs, more reactive enemies, smoother executions, more distinct playstyles. On paper, that's exactly what you want. But Souls-like audiences are extremely sensitive to feel. You can't fake it in a trailer. You can't patch perception overnight. This sequel is going to live or die based on the first hour players spend with it. If it immediately feels better, more grounded, more precise, then all of this developer transparency will pay off. But if it feels slightly off, that floaty narrative comes back instantly. Personally, I'm cautiously optimistic, because the fact that they're openly dissecting their own combat design tells me they understand what matters. And that's more reassuring than any cinematic reveal. I'm really curious what you think though. Did the combat in the first game feel off to you? And based on this teaser, does this look like a meaningful improvement or just minor adjustments? If they nail the feel, this sequel could genuinely redefine how people view the franchise. If they don't, well, we'll find out soon enough. Well, that's all from me for now. If you've enjoyed this kind of breakdown, then let me know in the comments. I'm working on something a little different for next time. I finally got into Space Marine 2 and I'm about 10 hours into it, and I want to do a proper early impressions breakdown. So, if that sounds like your kind of thing, consider subscribing and sticking around. And as always, have a great one.